Okay, so this is part two of our discussion of the demographic collapse of the Americas following the Columbian Exchange. In our previous discussion, we talked primarily about the effect of disease and other reasons why populations in the Americas collapsed after the Columbian Exchange. Now, I want to talk to you guys about something that you may not have thought about with regards to native population in the Americas, and that is exploitative, coercive, or forced labor systems. You'll notice that I'm not talking here about slavery, and there's a reason for that as we'll get into it. But what we are essentially talking about here is that labor that is not free, labor that is not necessarily fairly compensated. And there's a lot of daylight between free labor, where people choose to work and are compensated accordingly, and slavery. There is a scale within that space. And today we're going to kind of explore that space. And in particular, we're going to be talking about a system called the encomienda system, which you may never have heard about. People don't often teach it. I think it's really critically important. And I also want to talk about a legal category called gente de razón in Spanish Latin America. So here we go. Let's talk a little bit about forced labor, everybody's favorite topic. Okay, just to kind of set the scene, you'll remember that I said something about La Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend, with regards to the Spanish colonial system that occurred in the Americas, and we're going to be talking more about that on Thursday. But there is a reason why there is a sort of persistent story that gets told about the violence used in the Spanish colonial system against Native people. And that is because there was violence, because there was targeted, focused ethnic and racial violence against indigenous people, as this illustration depicts here. What you have is a gentleman in red with the hat. He is an encomendero. He is in charge. He is a colonial landowner. And the individual who he has by the hair, who is clearly badly injured, that person right there is a person who is made to work for him. So let us talk about this system a little bit. So the first thing we have to acknowledge is that, of course, there was slavery in the Americas prior to 1492. It isn't as though the Europeans who came over had invented a whole new system of thinking about labor. The Maya practiced extensive slavery, as did the Inca, as did the Aztec, as did groups throughout North America. However, when we talk about slavery in the Americas, like we talk about slavery basically everywhere else in the pre-modern world, this slavery was not race-based. And in fact, it often had a lot of different social connotations to it. Sometimes it wasn't something that could be inherited by a person. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it had religious connotations. I mean, think about the Aztecs. Like, their prisoners of war were essentially enslaved and then sacrificed. Mayan slaves were often sacrificed as kind of a gift to the gods when their masters died. But so slavery was not race-based. Sometimes it could be tied to foreignness, but that was different than looking at, say, color of skin or other physical connotations of enslavement. So, like, this is not the same thing as what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. I mean, after all, we also have systems of forced labor, or at least coerced labor, in the Americas prior to colonization. You'll remember the Mita in the Inca Empire, where 1/7 of the male population of every village was required to labor for public works every year. That labor tax was done and was not compensated in terms of like money or goods. You got room and board, but you didn't get paid. But there was an idea of reciprocity, because the work that you were doing was public work. It was work that was beneficial to other people other than just like the great Inca or like the king or whoever. It didn't just benefit one person, it benefited a community. So like rebuilding a bridge or paving a road, that was something that, yeah, it benefited the state, but it also benefited the public. And so as a result, like there was an idea that no, you didn't get compensation in terms of gold or something like that for your labor, but you did get services as a result. And so therefore there was sort of an exchange of labor for service, and that was less exploitative than the system is going to become. When the Inca Empire collapses and the Spanish move in to take over that territory, they find this labor system to be already instituted and very useful. Populations are not unused to the idea of being required to labor, but the Spanish change the template. They take the idea that a certain percentage of the population will have to labor for the benefit of the state every year, essentially continue the mita, but they're going to change what that labor is used for. So this right here is a depiction of people doing mita work in the Inca Empire prior to the Spanish arrival. Mita work could be stuff like farming, which was socially beneficial for everybody. It benefited the entire community. But one of the things we have to wrestle with is how the Europeans thought about those they conquered. And this means that we have to try to get our heads around the idea that some group of people decided that another group of people were less valuable, and therefore it was acceptable to exploit them. And that means that we have to try and understand what sort of questions Europeans were asking themselves about indigenous people. And so the first question that European conquerors kind of came about, and I mean, you can even see this in Columbus's writings in 1492, is what the heck do you do with the indigenous people? Quite literally, the questions were, all right, do we convert them to Christianity? Can they be made into converts and become citizens or subjects of the empire? Shall they be enslaved? Would they make good slaves? Columbus thought indigenous people would make an excellent group of slaves. He thought that they were kind and generous and simple and peaceful, and therefore would make excellent slaves. And then the option was, perhaps you just kill all of them and take the land. So some Amerindians, especially in the early portion of colonization during the very late 16th century, 15th century and early 16th century, were forcibly enslaved, and they were sold back to Europe and into other places as well. But that was not particularly profitable, and we will get into the ethics of this tomorrow, but it wasn't profitable because a lot of the indigenous people who were forcibly enslaved and sold overseas died very quickly as a result of exposure to diseases to which they had no immunity. So, with the question of what do you do with indigenous people, then there was a secondary question. Are the indigenous people even human? That was actually a question of some degree of actual, theological study. People went to the church and they asked the priests, hey, is this person, or this being who I have kidnapped and taken back to Spain with me, are they human? Or are they just some sort of super evolved animal? There was actual scholarship written about this. It's really gross to read. And thankfully, that sort of line of questioning died out relatively quickly. But there was kind of a secondary part to that question, and that was if Amerindians, if Native people in the Americas are in fact human, does that mean that they have the same legal rights and protections as people in Europe? Do you have to treat them the same way? Is their property their property? Is their body their body? Are their children theirs? And ultimately, the Queen of Spain, Isabella of Castile, declared, after much thought and contemplation and a lot of contradiction and hypocrisy, she declared that Amerindians, Native people in the Americas, were in fact human. The term that she used in the legal document was gente de razón, which translates from Spanish as people of reason. People of reasons, people who are capable of complex thought. And she says that these Amerindians, they are gente de razón, people of reason, and that because they are capable of thought, they have a soul and are capable of being saved and brought to Christ. And therefore, because Isabella of Castile was deeply, deeply Catholic, She believed that it was her duty as sovereign and the duty of those acting in her name to attempt to convert the Amerindian population of the Americas to Catholicism and to bring them to Christ. And therefore, she said, those people could not be enslaved. She forbade it. Now, you might ask, well, like, what right did Isabella of Castile have to state that? Well, frankly, her husband, Ferdinand, who you've probably heard of, Isabella and Ferdinand are the ones who financed Columbus's expeditions. Isabella was the more powerful of the two. She had the money. Her husband just had the army, and she funded it. So what she said went, and in fact, she was related to the Pope, and the Pope had granted upon her the title, Her Most Catholic Majesty. So what she said kind of had a lot of weight. That being said, Isabella of Castile did own slaves. They were just African slaves, and we'll get into that tomorrow. Now, so Isabella of Castile says, no, you can't have these people as slaves. They can be saved. They can be brought to Christ. So instead, the Spanish crown develops a loophole situation. They say, all right, so you can't buy or sell indigenous people as property. We won't let you do that. However, we will let you buy and sell something called an encomienda. So an encomienda was a grant of land, territory, that just so happened to have indigenous people living on it. This was very much like a fief in medieval Europe, which makes sense because Spain was feudal. And this land, this encomienda, was given to a Spaniard who was called an encomendero. The encomendero was supposed to, quote unquote, protect the indigenous people living on that land from raiding or warring tribes and pirates. His job was also to provide Christian instruction, to provide a priest and make sure people were baptized, to instruct people in the Spanish language so that they could be made part of the Spanish Empire. The encomendero was also supposed to develop and maintain infrastructure, provide housing and roads, bridges for the people living on this encomienda. But how does he do all of that, you might well ask? Well, through the native population, because this is just an extension of the feudal system. The native population, in return for the great favors being done to them by the encomendero, were meant to provide metals like silver or gold to the encomendero, or agricultural products like tobacco or cotton or sugarcane. And they would do this through labor. Now, theoretically, under this system, native populations were protected by the state. There were laws that established them as wards, meaning like legal minors, meaning that they're like children, okay? That the job of the encomendero was to protect these people who were seen as innocent and vulnerable. But that is not what happened, because the Spanish crown, which issued these laws, was all the way across the Atlantic. And who was going to stop encomenderos from abusing their privilege? And so as a result, encomiendas were frequently places of terror. Native populations were subject to widespread, frequent, and extraordinarily violent actions, everything from whippings to torture to death to rape. Ideally, this is what the relationship between an encomendero and the native person laboring for them is meant to be. This sort of like give and take, a patron-client sort of relationship. This is deeply idealized and very rarely actually occurred. Instead, you were much more likely to see this. This is in the Andes. This is in Peru. Here is an encomendero. Here you have indigenous people being forced to carry some sort of good up these mountains. Now, this semi-feudal system lasted into the early 1900s in some parts of Latin America, but officially the legal structure for it was ended by 1730 CE, and that is because the encomienda system collapsed. Firstly, they collapsed due to population loss. By the 18th century, the population of Amerindians capable of working had really declined, as we already talked about. The other reason is that it's not just that indigenous people had died. Indigenous people fled and resisted whenever they were capable of doing so. They knew the lands better than the Spanish, and they fled. The other issue was that the type of labor that the Spanish wanted indigenous people to perform was not the labor that indigenous people already understood. And thus, we're going to have to talk about this in just one moment. I'm going to have to transition over to another video.